for helping to organize this. I'm delighted to be here, and I know how important the program that the American University has been doing at the Washington College of Law. Having just taught a class there for the last 3 years, it's a very exciting and dynamic place to be for both students and faculty. And I'm very happy to be here in Tiller House, where you get the full range of sophisticated understandings of international law and their translation into concepts that I think are well understood by the public, or at least they provide that important role for public education. And I know I've used all those kinds of materials in my own work. You all have our panelists' bios, so I'm not going to read each one. But what we'll do is have an engaging conversation and then open up to all of you. The topic today is upholding human rights in times of populist nationalism. And we could have a long talk just about the term populist nationalism, but this is more of a human rights-oriented topic, and I think we all know what we mean by universal human rights under international law. And that'll be kind of the center point of the discussion, trying to understand the current dynamics that we're facing around the world, but particularly in more established democracies in North America and in Europe, and where it's coming from, trying to unpack what's driving it, both political and economic drivers, and what are the human rights implications of those dynamics. So what we're going to do is start with Betsy Andersen, who is the director of the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, used to be executive director here at the American Society of International Law for many years, and an impressive track record of work on human rights and Human Rights Watch and in the US and international tribunals. We'll then ask Laurence Burgorgue-Larson to speak. She's visiting here as a professor of law at the Sorbonne Law School at the Université of Paris, and is an expert on European Union law, inter-American law, comparative law, has taught all over the world, it seems, from the list, and we look forward to hearing from her. She's also, interestingly, a judge at the Constitutional Court of Andorra, and I would love to hear how you got that position. We all want to be in Andorra. And then we'll hear from Christof Heyns, who's a professor of human rights and director of the Institute for International and Comparative Law in Africa at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Dean of the Faculty of Law and Director of the Center for Human Rights. It's a lot of titles, Christof. I got to know Christof a bit when he was the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, and recently led the effort by the UN Human Rights Council to send an independent investigative team to Burundi. Much controversy from the government of Burundi around that, and might have something to say about that. So my first general question for all three, and we'll start with Betsy, is to think about the domestic drivers of this wave of populist nationalism and the human rights elements of it. I mean, we think about, first and foremost, when you hear that term populist nationalism, you think about political and civil rights, but also think about the issues of economic and social rights that are factored into that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ted, for the introduction, and to Wes and Claudia and Diego and my friends at ASIL and AU. It's really a pleasure to be back here at Tiller House and to participate in what I think is a really important conversation. I've got some ideas. I don't think I have any definitive answers, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation for teasing some of this out. I wanted to start maybe with a slightly provocative idea, just to wake everybody up. In thinking about what are the root causes of populist nationalism, I was struggling with a thought that perhaps the human rights movement is part of the problem, or at least it's not currently part of the solution. So what do I mean about that? And I was thinking about the Freedom House Freedom in the World survey, which is done every year and was announced recently. The most recent report, 2017 report, it's the 11th year in a row in which they have documented declining freedom in the world. And those of us in the human rights movement, hear that, wring our hands, tisk tisk about those repressive governments that just keep clamping down and clamping down. And I think don't pause for self-reflection sufficiently to think, I wonder what we're doing wrong. If we've got 11 years in a row of declining freedom in the world, if you were thinking about a company that lost money 11 years in a row, you'd call that a dog of an investment for sure. So what of a movement that is losing ground 11 years in a row? So what might we be doing wrong, and how might that relate to this backlash that we see in the form of populist nationalism? Well, I want to offer two ideas of drivers of populist nationalism that we may be missing in the human rights movement or not be adequately addressing. The first is income inequality. So we see in the rise of a globalized economy and technological change, large swaths of our populations are being left behind economically, feel disadvantaged, marginalized by this new globalized economy. And these disempowered populations we have seen in this country and in others are vulnerable to simple messages that populist nationalism offers, that blames others for their economic woes. So that is one factor that I think is a driver and is one that we in the human rights movement have not perhaps addressed adequately, and that ties in with economic, social, and cultural rights. And when we get later in our discussion into kind of responses, I've got some ideas about how we might reorient and re-emphasize economic, social, cultural rights to address that. The second driver that I think is an important one for us to think about is the disconnect between governments and citizens. And again, there's an element of disempowerment here, political disempowerment, that is alienating populations and making them vulnerable to a message of populist nationalism. And I would suggest that this is not just a disconnect between national governments and populations, but also international governance structures, including international human rights structures. And that there is, I fear, in our human rights movement, an elitism. It's a small international club that even national, domestic, local human rights organizations are closer sometimes to their international donors than they are to their constituents in the countries where they're working. They are more comfortable, and I say this as an organization that is a donor to human rights organizations. So I'm recognizing and grappling with the fact that we may well be part of the problem. They are some of our grantee organizations, those working on the front lines of the human rights movement, may be more comfortable speaking with me at a conference in Brussels or in New York than they are with the beneficiaries of their programs at home. And there was some interesting work that the Open Society Justice Initiative did a number of years ago, grappling with this problem that they were seeing in their work with Roma activists, and that the leading Roma activists who were their grantees were increasingly disconnected from the communities that they were intended to support. And this disconnect, of course, between human rights NGOs makes them, again, vulnerable to demonization by politicians who are championing this populist nationalist movement. They can be cast as foreign or foreign influenced, as meddling in domestic politics. And, of course, populist nationalism offers an antidote to that interference in domestic politics by these foreign organizations. And so those are two dimensions of this phenomenon that I just think are important for us as a human rights movement to grapple with honestly and and think about how we can address.
Yeah, that was excellent way to start the discussion. Laurence, continuing on this theme of diagnosing the problem before we get into ways to address it, what's the European feeling?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Ted. Thank you very much, Claudia and Diego, for the invitation. Let me try, before to present the causes and the roots, let me try to explain what I think it is populism. Actually, populism's central and permanent narrative is the juxtaposition of a corrupt political class, elite or establishment, and the people, the silent majority. Populism represents what some have called the democracy of suspicion, whereby the apparatus of representation, the parliamentary system, the parliamentary class, the elite, their experts, and so on, are subject to hostility, precisely for not being representative enough. And populists tend to dislike representatives. Typically, they want power to be immediately expressive, without mediation. And populists thus favor direct democracy. And the problem is that from being a very phenomenon mostly associated with illiberal states in regions such as Latin America during a long way, it seemed to have entrenched itself with the established, as you say, established liberal democracy. On the left, there are the parties of Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Italy, Les Insoumis en France with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and Jeremy Corbyn in United Kingdom, recently successful in the British election. On the right, well, in the United States, we have the spectacle of Donald Trump talking tough on building walls, keeping out Muslims, and making America great again. In Europe, we have Viktor Orban in Hungary, Miloš Zeman in Czech Republic, Kaczynski in Poland, not to mention Marine Le Pen in my country, with the Front National, who was very near to gain power in the last presidential election. And in the UK, the Brexit campaign, so conservative, like Boris Johnson, joining forces with Nigel Farage from the UKIP. So the wing-white populism is a little bit specific because it adds a second antagonism to us versus them, as well as a specific style of political communication. Firstly, based on a definition is very dangerous. Based on a definition of the power of the people as culturally homogeneous, right-wing populists juxtapose its identity and common interest, which are considered to be based on common sense, with the identity and interest of others, usually minorities, such as migrants, which are supposedly favored by corrupt elites. Secondly, right-wing populists strategically and typically use negativity in political communication. Tools range from calculated break of supposed taboos and disrespect of formal and informal rules, the political correctness, to emotional appeals and personal insults. This being said, I think it was a little bit important to have an idea what is populism. The causes of the impressive rise of populism in the recent years are very complex, are numerous, and I will try to present a lot of ideas. Clearly, populist parties, movement, candidates across Europe and United States have identified widespread discontent, as you say, concerning a range of political, economic, and cultural issues all very often interconnected. And these issues, populists capitalize upon, are largely the same across all countries, but there are obvious, of course, national specificities, and also some specificities between right-wing and left-wing populism. But in a nutshell, in the opposition, it is the opposition to globalization with two kinds of sub-issues, the economic one and the political one, the immigration one, which are constantly at stake in the populism, in the populist narrative. And it is striking to note that the opposition to globalization is uniform when it comes to economic issues. Global free trade has allowed out traditional communities, and also, of course, although some have benefited, but pockets of labor in erstwhile industrial heartlands have been completely marginalized, as also you said. Hence, and logically, blue-collar Trumpism, the hostility of Bernie Sanders to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the UK, the disaffection with the EU, in part of north of England, of north of Welsh, in the north and east of France, where all the industrial landscape has disappeared, is completely lost, destroyed. And for populists, the guilty is the EU. Very common design as the source, the origin, with globalization phenomenon, of all the industrial and social problems in Europe. It will be, from my point of view, completely bad or stupid to deny the element of truth of this narrative. There is some element very powerful. And it is not surprise that global free trade, whatever it others benefits, has generated a backlash very hard in the form of protectionist movement and nativist resentment. There is another issue with globalization when immigration, it is at stake now. As far as right-wing parties or movements are concerned, the opposition to globalization is uniform when it comes to immigration. And the discourse is important to notice, is not too outrageous against foreigners and migrants for left-wing populists, which in general have not developed an anti-immigration discourse. But on the other hand, for right-wing populists, immigration is not simply a question of economic competition, but it constitutes a threat against presumed identity of the people and their traditional values. And here is a very important and difficult problem. If this discourse is widely adopted by the right-wing party, there are some specificities, of course, among countries due to the historical backgrounds of each of them. For instance, in Hungary, one target is the Roma minority, while the Tea Party and Trump in the United States highlight Mexican and other immigrants from Latin America. And anti-Muslim position, in other words, Islamophobia nowadays is much more prominently than anti-Semitism and characterize very strongly right-wing populist position regarding immigration. So, to summarize for the first round of interrogation, it seems to me that populism, with a narrative characterized by the summa divisio, us versus them, the elite, the establishment versus the others, the people, the true people, has used has generated some negative effects. Has used some negative effects of the globalization in two of the sides, the economic one and the social one, with the immigration issue, to foster a kind of popular revolt, a kind of popular indignation. And it's very hard, because this kind of popular revolt, popular indignation, how to tackle it, how to handle it, it's quite complex.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurence. Christof, give us a view from Africa.
Very good. And as Ted mentioned at the beginning, I had the opportunity of being involved in an investigation in Burundi last year, which was very critical of the government there, and they were in turn very critical of us. So I don't necessarily think that I will become a judge in Burundi quite soon. I'll have to get some tips on that. But thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate. Thank you very much for the invitation. From my side, I also want to say a little bit about how I understand populism, and in particular nationalist populism, and then try to say something about how I see the drivers of nationalist populism. And I think it's perhaps useful to think of these worldviews, if one has on the one side nationalist populism, as opposed to what? And I would say it's as opposed to international liberalism, which of course became the prevailing, at least on the global level, the value system, especially since the Second World War. But before that, with Enlightenment thinkers, Kant and others as well. And in almost in a visual form, I tend to associate it almost with the idea of the movement from the idea that the world was flat to the idea that the world is round. And the symbolism of that is the idea that the world is a single moral universe. So it's not it doesn't go infinitely in all directions, and one doesn't know what comes, but you're locked into the same moral universe. And that idea of the world as being round, I think, has to a large extent driven the idea of a worldview characterized by a commitment to democracy, human rights, inclusion, tolerance, that the only limitations that there are on people are if they cause harm to others. And based in that, and then of course the establishment of international organizations. And underlying that worldview, I think the idea of democracy depends on how one defines it, but I think there are really two elements to democracy. On the one hand, the starting point of the idea that power is rooted in the population, in the electorate, but then the restraint on that power in the second place of human rights, that human rights are really part of democracy, and that emphasizes then human rights, the rule of law, that there's a sort of a core that each person has, which is not within the jurisdiction of the population as a whole. So there's built into the idea of democracy, as seen from liberal internationalist perspective, this idea of, to some extent, slowness, that one looks at what are the lessons from the past as they've crystallized into what we have as the human rights norms today, the struggles that have come over time, not just the considerations of today, but it's built into that, and the people who police that are the laws, the constitutions, and of course the judges as well. So there's an element of slowness built into the system, which is not simply subject to whatever the passions of the moment may be. On the other hand, nationalist populism, which I think, as Laurence has said, characterized by the idea of the common people who are exploited by, on the other hand, by the elite, who find their own values ingrained into constitutions, into laws, into a system which people say do not work for them. And from that perspective, there's not the idea that one wants to give the system time to eventually work for us. There's emphasis on direct action, there's the language of indignation, aversion to democratic institutions, but then also, of course, anti-globalization. And I certainly think that if one wants to start a new course in a law school today, and if you want to make money with that, it's how to disengage from treaties, how to denounce treaties, and as we've seen in many ways, this aversion to international organizations. And nationalist populism, I think, then mobilized passions around exclusionary identities, the idea of walls that are being built, from my perspective, the idea of a flat world as opposed to a round world within which everybody is part of the same moral universe, but it stretches out infinitely, and that means we're not really part of the same thing. And that often translates into racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and scapegoating of the other. Sometimes referred to as scapegoating particular migrants, Mexicans, Muslims, and whatever one wants to add to that particular list. And if that's the sort of starting point, then one can also ask yourself, what are the drivers of these two worldviews? And to me, it seems that with international liberalism, science, the emphasis on rationality, to some extent the heritage of the Enlightenment has played a strong role, to the notion of interconnectedness in the world, this idea of the round world, in which communications plays a big role, a cosmopolitan worldview plays a strong role, the ease of travel, at least of the elites, the ties of trade, which means that the economy is not simply local, the economy becomes global. And then, of course, also that security is seen as something global, much larger than it was seen before. And there's a spillover effect from, as the Second World War clearly showed, starting conflagration in one country and spills across the world as a whole. So on the one hand, the drivers from that worldview, I think this interconnectedness of the world seen as a round and as a single moral universe. On the other hand, with nationalist populism, it seems to me that there are concerns and discontent with the liberal world order on a number of fronts. A concern about a world without walls, and a discontent with a world without walls, and a world that is indeed round, which then translates into migration that takes place more easily, economic downturn in one part of the world affecting another part of the world, so to some extent people feel it's out of their control. The role of technology in bringing about the inequalities, which then may be translated into finding the scapegoating for one's own position. But it's in this world without walls where people feel that technology can have this effect of losing control and of their own immediate environment not being within their control. And also the view that a tolerant worldview is not up to deal with radical opposition, as presented by terrorism and other threats, and that human rights places constraints on the ability of government to ensure the safety of individuals. And there may be also disillusion with science, that people may feel they lose agency over their own lives. And that all translates into this idea of building walls around them. There may be also, as some people who write about this say, there are issues about human psychology, which may also say that the liberal worldview is based on the idea of altruism being the dominant concern of people, whereas others say, well, that's not really how the human psyche works. There's a balance between altruism and own interest, and to some extent the liberal world order may not give enough emphasis on the idea of own interest. And there may be an emphasis on the role of reason in international liberalism, which does not recognize the extent to which people are driven by passion, and that may be the consideration. So it may be a misunderstanding of what really drives us that people say may be one of the drivers of the emergence of nationalist populism. Also, the spectre that haunts liberalism is the idea that the individual becomes a replaceable entity, that we all become the same, and there's no real difference between us because we are held to this universal standard, and we move up to closer idea of interchangeability, and the individual from that perspective is not seen as part of human history, which is something concrete, something local, and it may be that also that sort of worldview plays a role also in emphasizing then the idea that history plays a big role, our concrete being here in this particular society, and then of course the closeness and the comfort of being together with people of one's own background. So I think these are some of the drivers. I do think it will be what we leave out now is to come to how does one address that, but perhaps that's a bit of setting the stage.
Yeah, no, that's great. Really thoughtful comments and setting the stage for a round two questions. But first I want to give a couple of my own thoughts into this and abuse my role as moderator. So I'm thinking about this particularly in the context of the election that we just went through here in the United States and what we've seen since then. And it seems to me that the big wake-up call is just how weak our basic understanding of human rights actually is in society. And what is at the core of human rights is much of what you said, Christof, is that we're all the same. That first and foremost, we're human beings and we share a certain set of inalienable rights and around human dignity. And when you see all the divisions that are erupting, it's around this breakdown of that basic concept of an understanding that we are all human beings and we have equal rights. And that is what is not being respected. But it starts with individuals not really accepting that proposition in the first place. And I think that's just a complete failure of the human rights movement, if you want to put it that way, if you're looking for someone to blame, to inculcate these values and through education, through families, through schools, through culture. It is not, the message is not coming through. And or people are so stressed out by all the changes of globalization that they feel so dislocated that they return to some other basic tribal identities. That's kind of an overarching point, but it plays out in terms of what we see in the us versus them dynamic. So what's at the heart of that? Minority rights too. So not just individual rights, but group identity rights. And I think that is a very contested notion still, where people challenge the idea that because you are a member of this group, you have some kind of elevated rights or privileges. And that doesn't seem fair to other people who are somehow disadvantaged by that status. And so we're a long ways from understanding, and that gets into the whole political correctness debate that's just rampant right now. And we see it on college campuses as well, but in our own political discourse in the United States. So we're not there yet in terms of understanding the distinction between the individual rights and the minority rights and the hierarchy of those rights. Another area I see of tension that ties to the economic aspects of globalization are labor rights. I mean, in the erosion of respect for labor rights and the power of labor unions to defend and expand those rights is really jarring, I think. And you see all the, gig economy, all of the ways in which people who are not working, say, for corporations with full benefits of healthcare and pensions are really struggling to get by. And where are their labor rights? Where are the movements that are going to organize them and defend the rights that they have under international law? And it's just, in the United States, there's like no discussion of this issue at all. So that would be another human rights element I would point out as missing here. And then I think the issue of media and the way in which it has become so polarized and fragmented through social media and other kind of cable news, all the ways in which we're consuming and producing news is becoming, in the way Betsy put it, more vulnerable to manipulation and attack by nationalists and populists. And they're actually in a weaker position as a result. And that's a core political right that is essential to the functioning of democracy. And so I find that a particularly troubling area, and we're seeing it, a range of behaviors and attacks against journalists that is really troubling, and whether it's actual physical and legal attacks, but also the rhetorical attacks, including in this country, are particularly problematic. And then my last point would be the global context. So we are still a world of sovereign states, and I think we're seeing a reassertion of national sovereignty that directly challenges the whole idea of international law and institutions, and we are struggling with how to find the common ground, how to reinvent what it means to be living in this moral planet together, where we have global public goods that need to be protected. And human rights should be one of them, but and we have a whole architecture that's been built up over 70 years of law and institutions and norms, and they're still not recognized as well as they should be, given all the effort behind it. I think the geopolitics right now, in which we see a crisis of confidence in the democratic West, we see a resurgence of authoritarians, much more collaboration and cooperation among them to push back against the push for universal human rights. And then these swing states in the middle, many of them democracies, other kind of in between, that are not stepping up to the plate to fill this vacuum. And currently, when we see a new administration here that is proudly proclaiming America first and in talking about interests as opposed to values. Yes, we have our values, but often they're obstacles to pursuing our interests. Interests drive our policies, not our values. Secretary Tillerson, I'm quoting almost word for word, we have a real problem in who is going to lead the kind of political movement around the world on behalf of human rights. When I'm talking about governments, it's always, in my mind, citizens and civil society. They're the vanguard of pushing for this. We can't rely on governments, but they can play an important role. So that's my 2 cents on the diagnosis of the problems. And now we're going to do a second round where we just think about, well, what are some human rights-based approaches to dealing with these problems? What needs to be prioritized given limited resources and giving this very complex set of factors? Betsy.
Okay, well, this was a really interesting, stimulating beginning, and I took lots of notes on what all of you said and points I want to pick up in the discussion. But let me begin with just sharing a couple of ideas about what I would identify as possibly effective approaches to responding to this set of challenges that we've outlined here. And coming back to my original preoccupation with income inequality and economic disadvantagement of large swaths of our population, I want to pick up on the idea of re-emphasizing economic, social, and cultural rights. Of course, in our human rights movement, we have both civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights. It's supposed to have kind of equal standing and status from the beginning, and yet we have seen over a long history and for a variety of reasons, I think, a prioritization of civil and political rights in our human rights movement and our human rights institutions. And I think that we have, by prioritizing civil and political rights, kind of left an important constituency unaddressed. And I think that there are important steps for us to take now in focusing on developing enforcement, promotion of economic, social, and cultural rights, and focusing on the more effective integration of economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights. And trying to use the tools that we have in our rights toolbox to address economic issues that are, I think, driving some of the appeal of populist nationalism. So this would include issues like tackling corruption, systemic discrimination in the workplace, labor righps. It's no coincidence that my organization has just in the last 6 months started a new labor rights program to grapple with the issues. I think, Ted, you're absolutely right that that's a gap in our movement and our efforts. I think generally what we need to be looking at as those who care about the rights agenda is to identify strategies that will demonstrate the relationship between rights and these everyday pocketbook issues. You can think back to 1992 and the Clinton campaign's "Economy Stupid." And at some level, I think we need to be a little more political in terms of thinking about what is going to motivate broader-based constituencies for rights, and I think these issues are critical. Second, I think, again, going back to drivers, and I identified the disconnect between government and the governed. I think programs that advance open government, make government more responsive, participatory, are really important. The open government partnership is one that requires support, reinforcement, and should be embraced by the human rights movement. I'm sometimes struck by how some of these global initiatives get kind of siloed, and this is where the anti-corruption people live, and this is where the good governance people live, and this is where the rule of law people live, and this is where the human rights people live. And I think there's a lot of important synergy to be gained by some cross-fertilization, and open government is an important one for the the traditional rights community to be thinking about. And then finally, I would just put in a plug for really addressing what you identified, Ted, and that is the lack of understanding of the rights agenda broadly in our publics, and doing that through civic education and outreach around human rights. I think there may be some low-hanging fruit here. There's some interesting work that's been done. I credit Sarah Mendelson, who was CSIS and then in the Obama administration, and her colleague Jim Ron at the University of Minnesota. They did some survey data on popular opinion about human rights and found some surprising things that actually, kind of depending on how you talked about rights and how you framed the question, human rights are actually very popular, even in places where you would think they might not be, where there might be a populist backlash. And that suggests that use of that kind of data to inform communication strategies around rights and civic education around rights and outreach and constituency building around rights could be very productive. My organization does a lot of civic education around rights. We've found people very receptive to a broad range of approaches, from traditional media and theater to new technology is ripe for reaching millions and millions of people. And I think with the right kinds of messaging, that could be quite impactful. Again, thinking about, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and if one side can tweet a compelling message, I think certainly the rights movement can tweet a compelling message, and we need to get smart about that. So I'll leave it there, and we can address other kind of connections between our thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Some very concrete ideas. Laurence?
Yes, I will disappoint all of you, because I have no answer. I have no answer. I have no answer. So, why? I need to begin saying that it's truly difficult, from my point of view, even impossible, to be able today to clearly first understand the populist movement and understanding to tackle it and to fight it and to present strategies. The scholarship is just beginning on this issue, on the sociological aspect or political aspect. So, above all, the populism is motivated by cross-cutting issues, so it's very difficult. So, in such a context, I will be very humble, considering the potential solution or counter-strategy which will permit to fight these new political tendencies. And the complexity for me is so important to be able to present some ideas, some magic remedies, especially when we get in mind that the populism narrative is completely focused on the identity issue. How to fight some discourse entirely based on the supremacy of national identity. How to fight it correctly. How to change the mind of people sensitive to such a matter. How to avoid, to jeopardize the founding basis of a society when the identity issue is organizing the polarization of societies. And it's a very, very strong problem. So I have no answer. Because the topic goes beyond the mere legal aspect of the problem. Historians, but also specialists of sociology, maybe psychologists, politics, economics, will need to continue to try to understand the motivation of the attractiveness of the populist discourse among a lot of citizens. We need to continue to do research, to think after to the good way to tackle the problem. So, this being said, as a lawyer, I'm just able and an academic, and not an activist. I have not a very long professional career in the activist movement, so I'm not able to give the answer you have presented. I'm not able, but just I'm an academic, and as a jurist, as a lawyer, I'm just able to present you some legal tools which could permit to fight the side effects of the populist discourse when it has gained power, because it's a huge problem in the Eastern Europe. And these side effects are, and also in the United States, are tersely put the decline of democracy. The decline of democracy. And it's so hard to see this. So I will not present some domestic tools, but I prefer present some of the tools we have at the European level, both within the EU and within the Council of Europe. And we will see if these tools are effective. The purpose is to see whether international law, more precisely international organization, effectively, in the European space, are in a good position to fulfill one of their main objectives, that is, avoiding the revival of the dark era known by European countries, the revival of the old European devils, in a nutshell, avoiding a huge revival of totalitarianism and dictatorship. So, within the EU, we have several tools. These several tools are actually existing to fight some infringement to the values of the EU. And these values are presented in the famous Article 2 of the Treaty on the EU. And these values are fantastic, quite numerous: dignity, liberty, democracy, rule of law, respect of human rights, including minority rights. And it is important to note that the Article 2, for this Article 2, these values are also the values of the member states of the EU. So shared values for the EU and for the member states. In this context, to fight an eventual infringement, supposed infringement to this value, we have several tools. Firstly, we have a very classical procedure of infringement based on Article 258 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, where here the powers of the European Commission are important to launch a judicial review before the European Court of Justice, and the violation, if the violation is characterized, must be very precise concerning the violation of a regulation of the EU or the case law of the European Court of Justice. Bon. One very precise procedural mechanism. Secondly, and more interestingly, more political, we have the famous Article 7 of the Treaty on the EU. It has been incorporated by the Treaty of Amsterdam and modified by the Treaty of Nice. Well, the purpose was to be able to fight the decline of the democracy by the new member states from the eastern part of Europe. the question here now is, what has been the practice? As for the infringement procedure, which is in the hands of the European Commission, it is clear that is not the accurate mechanism to tackle situations where the existence and the quality of democracy is declining. It has been used concerning against its very precise Hungarian regulation, which purpose was to establish an age discrimination between judges in Hungary. So the country has been condemned by the European Court of Justice, but without any bold results for the quality of democracy in this country. And the ruling has not been implemented by Hungary. As for the political mechanism, Article 7, very important. The intention to use it come about on several occasions. The French Roma expulsion by Nicolas Sarkozy. The Romanian political struggle between the president and the prime minister. The huge deterioration of the democracy in Poland and Hungary. The intention was to use it. It has been never used. Impossible. It's the atomic weapon. The conditions to use it are so difficult. We need the unanimity of the member state to tackle the problem. It has never been used. So we saw at the European level, at the EU level, that despite some tools, and I have not presented all the tools, but despite the presence of interesting tools, the EU institutions has been unable to put in action some very strong political warning to activate the current mechanism effectively. So what we saw, we see that EU law appears weak. EU law appears weak. The EU is weak and fragile when it comes to face the devastating consequences of populism. When this populism is gaining power in some countries, because in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, the government, populist government, are in the power. Concerning, and I will finish, concerning the Council of Europe system, my conclusion will be roughly the same. The Venice Commission, the Venice Commission function are very important, as well as the judicial review of the European Court of Human Rights. But notwithstanding, if we have in mind the Hungarian scenario, both mechanisms has been used, Venice Commission, European Court of Human Rights, without any success. That means without any significant and profound change in the politics led by Viktor Orban. Just a few precisions. The Venice Commission has scrutinized very seriously the constitutional reform process in Hungary. The Venice Commission has obtained some very interesting little success, some concerning very precise points. But at the end of the day, the new constitution has been published in 2012, and with very, very serious concern concerning the promotion of the Hungarian identity, one more time, and above all, some very important bills has been adopted to jeopardize the Constitutional Court powers. The Constitutional Court, Hungarian Constitutional Court, is today completely under control of the executive. As for the activity of the European Court of Human Rights, it is important to know a fantastic judgment of the court. the Baca judgment, Baca versus Hungary for June 2016. And what was the Grand Chamber of the European Court held that Hungary has violated the right of access to a court and the freedom of expression of András Baca, the former president of the Hungarian Supreme Court, and maybe above all, the former member of the European Court of Human Rights, the former Hungarian judge of the European Court. The point was that several constitutional and legislative reforms led to the early termination of Mr. Baca's mandate, expelling the critical judge for the highest office in the Hungarian judiciary, without providing any possibility for judicial review. And the judgment is only the latest episode in the series of very bad action of the urban government. Even though the judgment is amazing, even though the European Court tackles the issue without fear, being very strong in the ruling, and the ruling is amazing, Viktor Orbán is still in power. The implementation of the judgment it doesn't exist. I have checked this morning the implementation process held by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, and he is still saying, I'm waiting for the general measure that the Hungarian government say it was able and to get effective. And at the end of the day, nothing. So my conclusion is very pessimist one. I'm so sorry. And I have not been creative as you. I was just able to present you some tools and to present you the ineffectiveness of this tool right now at the European level. Voilà.
Thank you. Okay, well, realism is important.
I'm so sorry.
Are you going to cheer us up, Christof?
Well, I was actually planning by this stage of the proceedings, I should really have the answer and be able to produce it to you. But I think in view of what we've heard, I'll be a bit more modest and have two I think, basic things that I want to say. In the first place, I think that one should resist but not demonize populism. But with that, I mean, we need to understand what we actually have gone through now is to try to identify the driving causes and ask to what extent can it be, in a way, neutralized, I suppose, but on the other hand, to what extent should some of those concerns be taken on board? And it's a very important process, I think, to try to identify what should be accommodated and what should not be accommodated. And against that sort of background, I think in line with what Betsy said earlier, the inequality, the global inequality, the question of socioeconomic rights linked to that, the strategic development goals, I think are very important in terms of addressing some of the underlying concerns. From my own perspective, I would want to add to that as well, and again, I will just pull out a number of things that I've been involved myself, and I don't pretend that this is the big answer. But from my own perspective, the role of technology with drones, with autonomous weapons, and in many other ways as well, technology and the digital divide, I think, plays a big role in terms of increasing inequality as well. So if one talks about one of the underlying drivers of populism is that people feel the system doesn't work for them, that they're not willing to defer gratification because they don't think there's going to be something along the way. The slowness of the human rights movement isn't working for them. Coming from Africa, I do think that if one looks at the increased imbalance of power that comes with technology, if one talks about drones and those sort of technologies, but also just the value of human life. If one talks about somebody in a digitally connected area of the world, if one person is shot by the police, this is shown across the world, and rightfully so, because it's an infinite tragedy when one person is shot unnecessarily. But if 6 million people die, or if one looks at Burundi and other states, when thousands of people die, that doesn't come onto the world stage. And I think underlying that dynamic is the fact that it's inevitable that the world will say, well, we are more concerned, and in terms of the importance that we attach to issues about accountability and so forth, about the issues that come into our rooms and that are visible. And I think that just further skews the imbalances in the world. And I do think if the impact of technology and the way in which it amplifies existing inequalities and really drives it in different directions, I think if that's not addressed, then to ask people to really believe in the system and accept that international institutions will, down the road, will provide solutions, I don't think that's going to work. I think also another point I want to make in that same direction of trying to see what are the underlying causes and to what extent should we work with some of them and try to bring them on board, is I often think about the way in which universality is projected. And if one asks somebody what is universality of human rights, they say, well, the same rules apply to everybody everywhere. And that's, of course, part of universality. But I think the missing part of that definition of universality is the second point, which is not just that all the rules are made applicable to everybody in the same way, but it's also that everybody has a role in how these rules are formulated and how they're applied. In other words, the same stake in international organizations, the same role and the same weight in terms of defining what those rules are in the first place. So I would certainly think that instead of a top-down kind of approach, and with my own involvement in UN, I'm very aware of the extent to which we think from within those particular circles, and many of you also involved in it maybe as well, think about these ideas coming out and these monitoring coming from Geneva, coming from New York, from those parts of the world for the rest of the world. And I think that's very dangerous, that we see human rights really as something that is top-down, the UN-driven international human rights as well. So I would think we should also think about ways in which one accommodates diversity, in which one accommodates to some extent, if that's part of the human psyche, identity, concreteness of individual existence as opposed to abstract ideas. How does one make sure that, in a way, one makes sure that people can identify on a level of passion, not just of reason, with the systems that we have? And I want to offer very minor examples. But I think, for example, within the United Nations, something that a few of us proposed about 20 years ago, well, a number of people have proposed this, but in a report to Mary Robinson, we proposed that the treaty bodies should really sit in different parts of the world, not only sit in Geneva or in New York. But if one starts with treaty bodies moving to sit, for example, where the major regional systems sit, or perhaps in other places as well. At the time, one of the arguments against this was it is very expensive and heavy, and I think people mentioned to us, I forget the tonnage of equipment that they need to take. This may be an area where technology now may make it easier. If one needs to have translation systems and you don't have those big earphones and things that you have to fly around in systems, the technology is also more available. So the idea that top-down kind of approach is broken more and people do meet, it's perhaps more inconvenient for people to meet in different parts of the world. But I think symbolically this is an important kind of step. In the second place, I want to say that I think regional systems are important platforms for breaking this sort of top-down approach. Regional systems, of course, are part of the international structure. But regional human rights systems, the three well-established ones, but then also there are others that are evolving, I think bring it closer to home and allow people also to have a platform. If I think about Africa, 54 countries, very difficult for Africa to have an impact within the UN system itself, given the way that is structured. But if one thinks about, and the one example I want to give here is we had a class today at American University where I was talking about the African Charter and the concept of duties. And the concept of duties to me is something very interesting. If one talks about duties in a very specific context, not the idea that duties are preconditions for rights, but once you have rights, these rights are limited, and you can either see it as limited by abstract concepts such as necessity, reasonableness, proportionality, and so forth, Or you can perhaps also have something that's more intuitively understandable. It's limited by duties. So one has rights, but those rights may be subject to certain duties. And of course, as we know, that's part of the African Charter and the way in which this is conceptualized within the African system. And I do think such ideas are things that can perhaps have more currency when it has a platform from which it can develop and then find its way into the international system. Whereas if individual states have to participate within the UN system, it is more difficult for them to come up with an idea that really has traction and has support to come up. So I do think that regional systems, not just on the concept of duties, but just on in terms of making it closer to home, which I think is part of the problem, is that the UN is the recurring theme people have about the treaty bodies, about the UPR, about the Human Rights Council. It's very far. So to bring it closer to home, I do think regional systems are important platforms that should be developed. And then in the third place, the idea of human rights education that has been mentioned. Human rights education and capacity building. It seems to me that if we think that the principle of subsidiarity has at its top the ICC, but on the bottom we say, yes, it's only if the domestic courts cannot deal with these cases that it will go up. But if the domestic courts don't have the capacity, then it really becomes almost an empty concept. And then it's no surprise to me that there's resistance from within the African countries to the idea of the ICC, because it's seen as something foreign, it is seen as something that comes down from the top and intervenes. Now, I personally think it's very important to have the ICC functioning, but in order to have the ICC functioning, we must build the bottom of the pyramid. We must ensure that people in Burundi, which withdrew from the ICC, of course, but there's capacity there, that it's a realistic step for them to be able. Part of it may be that there's not the political will to prosecute, of course, but that is exacerbated by the fact that there's not really the capacity to do it as well. So I do think a capacity process, capacity building process will, in the end, strengthen the international system and strengthen the international organizations if people feel this is not taken out of our control and it's imposed from the top then. And just the last point I want to make on that particular point, on capacity building and on human rights education, is something which I've over the years had the opportunity of seeing operating in action, and these are moot court competitions. So there's one at American University for Latin America, there's one in Europe, there's one also around the ICC, and many other moot court competitions. There's one now in Geneva as well, in Room 20, a world competition, of which the explicit purpose is to get people to participate from the countries that are normally not participating. So this year, China, Russia, and others are participating in much larger numbers. Now, my own feeling would be, having seen moot courts in operation, is that if this gets into schools as well on a large scale, and in South Africa this is now something that hopefully will happen next year, and I'm not saying this is a solution to all the issues, but so in South Africa we've had a moot court competition for I think 7 years now. Next year, and that was based on schools that are volunteering to come and participate. They go to the Constitutional Court in the final round, the Constitutional Court judges hear it, and it's something really inspiring for people who go out. And it's largely based on common sense. Of course, it's based on the Constitution, but people have to argue whether you can wear a nose ring to school or rasta hair, or if you're pregnant, whether you can be expelled from school. It's largely based on common sense kinds of issues, which I think emphasizes the fact that it's not just a document, it's not just ideas that come from somewhere else, but we have to argue both sides, and we have to find a solution to this problem. And so next year, if all goes well, this moot court competition will be the comprehension test across the country in all schools. And they have to argue both sides. And then those who want to participate in the moot can do so as well. And Ghana is now doing the same. Uganda, I hope, will next year do the same. Mozambique will do the same. And so I can almost anticipate the effect that something like this, again, not immediately, not on the sort of direct action basis, but the slowness that comes in, that in 10 years, 20 years' time, if every school child has that experience of working from common sense and then finding out we need to solve these issues, and yes, the Constitution can help us, yes, the international system can help us, but we don't go to the international system first to solve our problems, because then you have that sense of alienation instead of this concrete engagement that one may have. So I think there are many other examples as well. that everyone from their own background can have, but those are certainly things that I've been involved in. Just to conclude, I think it's also, the first point I want to make then is to say the threat, the challenges of nationalistic populism, I think should in the first place prompt us to do some reconsideration, some introspection, some reassessment of where we are and how should we go about the human rights project. The second point I want to make, and the last one then, is to say, I do think, however, that in the end, I take some kind of comfort from the idea that if it's true that we live, as it is true that we live in one world, but in one moral universe as well, there's really no other answer than a system that defines that there's a certain core of interest that should not be infringed by society, by the state itself. The Human Rights Project has come through struggle. The Human Rights Project, I think, is the closest approximation that we have of all the struggles of the various centuries in my country, in your countries as well, that has percolated into defining that core of interest that should be protected. We know after so many years that if you're going to discriminate against somebody on the basis of morally irrelevant grounds, they're going to resist. If you're going to tell the person you must believe in this or you can't believe in that, they're going to resist. So we know now that there's a certain core of things that we must protect if we do not want the country, the society to explode. And for that reason, I think we may be in a time of great difficulties for the Human Rights Project, and we may fight with each other and fight with many other people about this as well, but in the end we're going to come back to the idea of human rights in one way or another. And so I don't think one should lose in that sense hope for the Human Rights Project. It's actually, I think in the long run, it's not less human rights. Some people say, well, we should now to overwinter this problem, we should get rid of part of the Human Rights Project. I don't think that's the case. What we need is more human rights in the end. And even if it goes through a dip, in the end, we're going to come back to the very foundations on which the only solution for such a world that can really exist. There's an inherent logic that I think is worth holding on to.
That is beautifully optimistic way of jumping through all the different discussions we had here. I like the way you connected the international to the national and the local and the regional in between as understanding how this is operating as a system, as different levels that reinforce one another when it works well. And I think your point about the European Union makes that clear because the member states themselves, by their own constitutional design and practices, largely adhere to these norms and then created a community that reflects that and added another layer of enforcement and review. Unfortunately, it's not, that level is not going so well, and I think partly it is a political will problem. I think your last point about what's the alternative here? I mean, maybe the human rights movement needs to be blunter about if we don't follow some common set of rules, we're going to have war. We're going to have conflict, and we need to be clearer about what those alternatives are and contrasting it with some kind of rule of law system. I also, Betsy, your point about politics, I think in this country, we continue to have this endless debate about healthcare, but rarely do you hear about the right to healthcare. It's not often characterized in that sense, even though it is a basic norm of international law. And so when we think about why is that, well, it costs too much. Well, that's a problem around the world. That's a political choice regarding allocation of resources. There are many, many countries that have decided to allocate resources in a way that do provide the right to health care. So we have to be clear that this is ultimately a political choice that our legislators are making and that citizens are trying to influence for better or for worse. Two other very quick points before opening it to you all. One is we didn't talk that much about the role of the private sector in all of this domain. And it's growing and in general in our lives, in our internationally, tremendous political power and financial power. And their control, for example, of big data and all the human rights implications regarding privacy and freedom of expression. This, to me, seems to be a very important area that needs much more attention and work and a place for lawyers to come in and say, okay, here are some basic norms, now we need some codes, we have a certain set of voluntary principles, but this debate about creating a treaty around business and human rights, I think deserves a lot more priority. And then related to that is it time now to think about some kind of basic norms to regulate the internet that protect human rights, particularly right to privacy and freedom of expression, but at the same time manage or mitigate the downsides of the internet. What we're seeing now, the weaponization of the internet, the interference in democratic elections, the way it's being used by violent actors. I think this is a place, again, for lawyers to bring that set of different interests and equities and try to figure out the right balance in a way that protects all of these fundamental human rights. So I wanted to throw that into the mix as well. And we have a microphone somewhere behind here, and I see a hand in the back. And why don't we take a few interventions? If you want to identify yourself.
Stanley Kober, I'm a member. Several years ago, I was at a conference at Georgetown. The Deputy Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan. The speaker was the then American speaker, Undersecretary of State William Burns, now at Carnegie. And the United States would like to have a strategic partnership with Azerbaijan. But I have to tell you, in the spirit of friendship, Azerbaijan has problems with human rights. So the Deputy Foreign Minister got up to reply. Azerbaijan would like to have a strategic partnership with the United States. But I have to tell you, in a spirit of friendship, the United States has problems with human rights. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. In other words, who are you to talk? This is the problem. The Cold War ended. I was a student in the Soviet Union in this, when the Helsinki Final Act was signed. I was astonished when the Cold War ended at the emphasis Soviet officials put on human rights. On the Helsinki Final Act, the United States was right. We were wrong. We have to abide by these human rights rules. They said it then. Those days are gone. Our example as a model is gone. I think that's part of the problem we are confronting.
Okay, why don't we take a couple of the comments and we'll take note and intervene later. One here and one here.
So my name is Adam Muller. I'm a genocide scholar and critical of cultural theory at the University of Manitoba in Canada. I'm also spearheading the creation of the country's first interdisciplinary master's degree program in human rights. It's which is a little more obvious than it sounds when you realize that we host the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation as well as the ATG for Human Rights in that. In trying to put an interdisciplinary program together, we've had to deal with a variety of conceptions of what human rights are and how they work. In particular, I've been challenged by the view of many philosophers that human rights thinking is a species of magical thinking, because it proposes that we are a kind of moral being without taking due account of the way, particularly but not exclusively, indigenous peoples think about what their identities are and how they're formed and what their moral being actually is. It's difficult, in other words, for philosophers to accept that we should prefer a human rights regime to a robust civil or series of civil rights regimes. And so when you ask the question, what else do we have? Well, we have our civil rights. And I guess my question is, what's wrong with that? Why isn't that the project?
Civil rights.
Yeah, to refine and secure and defend and upgrade our civil rights at the level of the nation, right? Before trying to pretend that we are or have this mystical essence that's our humanity that sort of extends to everybody, everywhere, that just happens to be a thing that 18th century Europeans created.
Okay. And here?
Hey, first of all, thank you to everyone. This has been one of the richer panels I've been to in many years, and to Aisel and Washington College of Law for putting it together. And I was worried that I was going to be the contrarian in the room, going, but maybe human rights community bears some responsibility for this. But given it's the first thing we heard, I assume this is a safe space. In full disclosure, I spent a number of years at the Justice Initiative. I might have absorbed some of that concern over the disconnect and elitism of the human rights project. But I just wonder whether there's something that's not just economic and social rights. There's something deeper here. It's about dignity. The alienation that is felt by the people that are part of this, that are supporting this populist backlash. It's not just economic dislocation. It's that nobody said, to be honest, globalization, you may have suffered from it for the greater good. Thank you for that. Instead, they feel lied to, taken advantage of, and to some extent, laughed at. And human rights hasn't grappled with this. There's an extent to which it's contributed to the backlash by not being able to deal with class, not having a language for dealing with class, not seeing issues of class as in any way related to human rights. And you've got this weird thing in the US where, at the macro political level, you have comments about deplorables, but rights respecting, rights advocates who would never use a derisive term for members of the African American community or Latino community or Muslim community or LGBT community can just talk about rednecks and hillbillies, and that's okay. And that I wonder whether there's, is part of the solution, is there a sense of we've lost the notion of social origin as a basis for dignity, as a basis for inclusion? Is there a way that we can try to reclaim that? Because it's there in the basic documents. And in doing so, Laurence talked about, populism is about identity. When rights focuses solely or predominantly on race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, it risks playing into that identity debate. But by looking at things like social origin, we can try to move beyond the exclusive focus on the lines that are being used by and contributing to this populist backlash.
Very good. Excellent. We got 3 very good comments, and I'm not sure if there are any really questions, but it gives us a lot of food to comment on. U.S. model is gone, reinforcing civil and political rights, and then how do we deal with this identity debate? Who wants to just jump in?
Well, maybe I'll jump in on the first two, because I think they actually are juxtaposed against each other in an interesting way. And I think it's precisely the difficulties you have, potentially fixing on a U.S. model is the answer to the second question, which is why not just focus on civil rights at the national level, is that there's no check then on, potential distortion of that model. And so, I think you're absolutely right that the U.S. record in recent years, well, historically, is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and it's precisely because of those flaws that we don't want to be, advocating the U.S. model, but in fact, clinging to these international norms, these universal norms that we all can have a stake in and work on perfecting and then implementing perfectly in different countries. So I think that, and that would be, and the risk of focusing only on national civil rights is precisely what we see, here in the United States.
It will be hard for me. Just a very provocative thought, very, very, very provocative. The debate has changed. It's not yet populism. It's human rights, and when you begin your intervention in for our first round, you have pointed out the problem of the happy few. The human rights movement, the human rights organization, ONG, United Nations, the happy few, this international person, internationalized human being who are working in a very privileged world, which in the long run has been completely has been completely has changed, being a technocratic world, the NGO, human rights world. And what are our discussion? Human rights movement. It's true, it's part of the problem, but it's not the sole problem. It's just to begin. It's very, very interesting, because I think that the populism is so complex that we need we need to go more beyond our little world of human rights or activist, of a human rights lawyer. We need to go the huge causes and roots of the problem. And it is not only based on human rights discourse and project, as you say. Human rights project is a very, very Anglo-Saxon way to speak. Because never, for instance, with the French language, we are talking about projects. We are talking about ideals, but not projects. As if human rights was a political project. And in France, for instance, we don't have this kind of thinking. It's quite striking for me. So I try to continue. I am very sensitive with your thought about the social origins, because it's a transversal element. And effectively, one maybe of the problem linked with the identity discourse is effectively the human rights law, international, national, as completely separate human beings in categories. And this kind of separation has led to a very strong fight between communities. And this is problematic because the common basis of a society is completely infringed by this way of seeing the human beings by categories. So finding a transversal element is quite interesting as a social one. And one last thought. We never think about general interest of a society. We have all. Alors, you talk about this with duties, and it is a link. Of course, we have all human rights. We need to defend them. We need NGOs. But we need to think also that there is a moment where the general interest is more important than a human rights approach. And this kind of thinking nowadays, I think it will be important to develop to avoid the fragmentation of the society. And as a French, I have in mind some religion questions in my country.
Very interesting. Okay, Christof, I've been giving the signal that we're wrapping up, so you get the final word.
No, I don't want to.
Positive,
No, bring out your
On our
optimism.
optimistic note.
Exactly, we need one.
Just on the issue of Human Rights Project, and for me it's a useful term because I think what I want to emphasize is the agency. So there's nothing natural or necessary about human rights. I think there's inherent logic in it, but it's not going to happen unless people do it. And I think for that reason, to me, it's useful to think about it as something that comes out of struggle. It's people who look at what had happened and say never, never again. Okay. And then they realize this thing, but they do it in a not all at once, of course. They step by step manner. And it's a project which is not, if it's not taken over by NGOs or not run forward by NGOs, by government officials, by you and me, it's not something that's going to happen. So it's a project which means it can also fail. But just on the issues that were from the floor, the role of the United States, I think what struck me most about that is just on a very concrete level, is on the death penalty. When one is in a country where the death penalty is used very extensively, almost always the argument is, why are you saying to us we shouldn't have the death penalty? The US has it. Of course, I think the US executes now something like 34 people per year. It's in terms of the other contenders for the first position in the world is relatively low, but symbolically it is so important, and it influences the whole debate. And what you can achieve in this project as well, because of the The second point I want to make there is because of the responsibility that comes with power, and to play a leading role in the world. Now, if that role diminishes, then of course one can argue that the responsibility will also diminish. I do think it's, and there are those who say, well, maybe that will mean other people will come and other states will come and play that role. I think that's a very optimistic sort of role to play. And perhaps just to the last point is on the question, why not just civil rights in one particular country? I think it comes back to me the interconnectedness, that world security, and I don't think we often emphasize it enough, that those who look at these things, who look at systematically over the centuries, the millennia, at peace in the world, we haven't had for the last 70 years since the UN was formed, and people may say this is because I work for the UN and so forth, but since the UN was formed, and with its idea of the triangle of security, development, and human rights, that those things are interlinked. And so, in other words, if one looks at the Charter and the way it was evolved as well, initially when it was drafted here at the Martin Oaks, the idea was simply it's a power map. And then in San Francisco, the idea came, well, world peace must be based on human rights because of the experiences in the Second World War. And I think that so far, we have no guarantee that this is going to last, but it is unusual in the world history for 70 years not to have a war between the major powers. And that has been the result, I think, of this link of security, human rights, and development. And I think the danger is that this may become unhinged. If the human rights component is taken out, it's purely a power map. It's only hard power that plays the role, and it's only national considerations of one state looking at what they do within their own borders, and it's not seen as something that national security is based on global security. I do think we're then into serious problems, not only as far as human rights is concerned, but also as far as security, our very existence is concerned. It's not a very optimistic.
I don't think I could do any better than what these three panelists have contributed to this discussion. It's extremely rich, as you said, and thank you all for participating. I hope we can continue afterwards. There's a little reception, I guess, in the room next door. Please join me in thanking the panelists.